Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, welcome back. We are covering the argument from dependency. In the first session, we went over the argument itself and made the argument, and we came to the conclusion that the universe and everything that we perceive is dependent and must be dependent on something eternal and necessary. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Islamic tradition and see how this argument of dependency fits in. The very first thing is, we know from the Quran, chapter 3, verse 97, for example, that God is independent of all that exists. Allah is the only one that's truly independent. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, that there is nothing like Him. There's no likeness to Him. There's nothing that comes close to Allah. Everything else is creation, and Allah is the only creator. As Allah says, for example, in chapter 35, verse 15, O mankind, it is you who stand in need of God, whereas He alone is self-sufficient, the one whom all praise is due. The one to whom all praise is due. Now from this and many other verses of the Quran, it becomes abundantly clear that Allah is independent, free of need. He's al-Ghani.
From this.
Should we go from the beginning, or how do you want to?
You said now from this, just before, from this we learn that He's free of need.
Okay. So from the Quran, brothers and sisters, it becomes abundantly clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free of need. He's completely independent. And everything else, which is His creation, is completely and utterly dependent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The classical exegete Ibn Kathir comments on the above verse, stating, they need Him in all that they do, but He has no need of them at all. He is unique in His being, free of all needs, and has no partner or associate. This is simple theology. These are the simple things that we understand and appreciate as Muslims. That Allah is completely free of need. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Ikhlas says He's As-Samad. And As-Samad is a very powerful word because it signifies and highlights that it's pointing towards the one that's completely independent, free of any need in any way, shape or form. Yet everything else in existence is completely and totally dependent upon Him. Completely and totally dependent upon Him. So the argument from dependency, the conclusion that we come to, that everything that we exist, everything that we perceive, the entire universe is dependent upon an eternal, necessary, independent being. That is simply the conclusion that we find in Islam in regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So another thing that we should explore is, what else can we conclude? Like from the argument from dependency, we conclude that this dependent existence, this dependent universe, and everything that we perceive is dependent upon an eternal, necessary, dependent being. What else can we conclude about this necessary, independent being? If we think about this and we reflect upon this, there are a few conclusions that we can come to. Number one, that this necessary being is all powerful. I would say this is a very rational, intuitive conclusion. Why? As the sum of all dependent things, including the universe that contains immense power, is dependent upon Him. So everything in existence, if we perceive the universe, there is immense amounts of power within this universe, potential power that's within this universe. And if this entire universe with all of its power is dependent upon this necessary being, well, it's safe to conclude that this necessary being must be all powerful. This necessary being has a will. Why? As this necessary being chose to bring everything dependent into existence. So the universe didn't have to exist. It didn't always exist. Therefore, this cause, this necessary being, chose to create the universe, this dependent universe. And if it chose to create the universe, well then, a choice points towards a will. This necessary being, we can conclude, must be one and alone. Now, to establish this, we can bring into play the argument of conceptual differentiation, which is that if someone was to argue or postulate that there is more than one necessary being, there's two or three, well then the onus of proof is on them. They need to now highlight why this is the case. They need to differentiate between these necessary beings. Because if they say all of these necessary beings are exactly the same, well, they're not talking about many beings, they're just talking about one being. Because to differentiate something, or say that there is more of one than something, there has to be something that differentiates them. Now, for example, if I said to you right now, what am I holding in my hand? You would say a phone. What about if I turn around and said to you, well, no, it's not a phone. I'm holding 5 phones in my hand. You would think I'm silly. And the reason is because my claim of there being 5 phones here has to be substantiated for you through you observing some sort of difference. There has to be something that differentiates them. You know, it could be I were literally holding 5 phones, they're stacked one on top of each other. So they're occupying different space, right? There has to be something that differentiates them. If I say there's 5 phones here, they're just lapping each other and moving at the same space, in the same space and doing exactly the same thing. Well, I'm not really talking about 5 phones, I'm just talking about 1 phone. So for there to be more than one necessary reality or being, then there has to be something that differentiates those beings. And if there isn't, and again the onus of proof is on them, they have to establish and show why that's the case. If they can't do that, well then it is only one. This necessary being, I would even argue, must be all-knowing and all-wise. Now why do I say this? And think about this for a second. Every dependent thing is arranged in a particular way. Right? So as we know about dependent things, they have a certain arrangement. The fundamental building blocks are arranged in a specific way. The fundamental building blocks of the universe are arranged in a specific way. Okay? Now, so every dependent thing is arranged in a particular way, with the possibility, in brackets, with the possibility of other arrangements. Now we know that dependent things could be arranged in other ways. To fit, now, so every dependent thing is arranged in a particular way to fit perfectly into the grand scheme of things, right? So there is a specific order. The universe is arranged in a particular way. Now from an Islamic perspective, as we've touched upon before as well, we know that the universe is fit for purpose, is ordered in a particular way where it allows for intelligent life to exist. You know, it's arranged in a way where the universe can continue to function. Life can continue to exist. All of these things show a specific arrangement of the fundamental building blocks of the universe. Now, what does this tell us? That if this necessary being has arranged this universe in a particular way which is fit for purpose, well then that highlights knowledge. This being must be all-knowing and all-wise because there's wisdom behind this particular arrangement. It's arranged to serve a particular function and purpose. So we can conclude and we can safely say that this necessary being must also be all-knowing and all-wise. Now what this does, brothers and sisters, in our da'wah is that you're going from using the dependency argument to conclude that there is a necessary being to now fleshing this out a little bit more and highlighting to people that this necessary being there is all powerful, has a will, is one, is all-knowing, is all-wise. And when you now give this additional information and conceptually clarify these things further, this is linking it back to our tradition because all of these things we've rationally concluded are in line with what we know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's all powerful, He has a will, He's all wise, He's all knowing. You know, He is one, uniquely one and alone. So it really draws the person closer to connecting the dots and understanding who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. And if you look at it from the perspective of Islamic theology, we know that we have in our tradition, Islam's intellectual tradition produced the likes of Ibn Sina, who articulated a similar argument. He maintained that God is wajib al-wujud, the necessary existence. And Ibn Sina argued that God necessarily exists and He is responsible for the existence of everything else. Everything other than God is dependent, which Ibn Sina described as mumkin al-wujud. So everything, as Ibn Sina articulated this as well, that is dependent upon the necessary reality, the necessary being who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even Imam al-Ghazali, he articulated a very similar argument and he states, there is no denying existence itself, something must exist. And anyone who says nothing exists at all makes a mockery of sense and necessity. Meaning we perceive things to exist, they're all around us. I mean, you wouldn't deny these things. They are, as we said, self-evident, right? The proposition that there is no denying being itself then is a necessary premise. Now, this being which has been admitted in principle is either necessary or contingent. What this means is that a being must be self-sufficient or dependent. From here we argue, if the being, the existence of which is conceded by necessary, then the existence of a necessary being is established. If, on the other hand, its existence is contingent, every contingent being depends on a necessary being. For the meaning of its contingency is that its existence and non-existence are equally possible. Whatever has such a characteristic cannot have its existence selected from without a determining or selecting agent. This too is necessary. So from this necessary premise, the existence of a necessary being is established. In a nutshell, I know this is very complicated language, but in a nutshell, what he's saying is that when you perceive things in the world around you and you conclude that they are dependent, that they did not have to exist, this naturally leads us to the conclusion that they must therefore be dependent on something outside of themselves, which allows them to exist in the way that they exist, with the arrangements that they have. So this particular argument is a part of our tradition. And we can find, and as we've established already, that the Quran, what we learn about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is in line with what we are concluding here via this particular argument. Now we'll stop here for this session, inshallah. Brothers and sisters, I know this may be a bit technical, inshallah, but go over the section again if you have to. The argument is very simple. The argument is extremely simple and it's very intuitive. In a nutshell, again, just to summarize it for everyone, things can be either dependent or necessary. Right? We know dependent things have certain qualities, characteristics, they're limited physical qualities. They have limited physical qualities. Their fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in many different ways. They require something outside of themselves to exist, and so on. So these qualities highlight dependent things. We see dependent things all around us. When we reflect upon the universe, we know the universe, observing it, understanding it, it has limited physical qualities. Its fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. All of these things tell us that the universe is dependent. If the universe is dependent, it must be dependent on something outside of itself. Someone can argue it's dependent on something else dependent, but that leads us to the problem of an infinite regress of dependencies, and therefore we wouldn't have a universe. And therefore the only real sound rational conclusion is that the universe and all that we perceive is dependent, and it depends upon something necessary, a necessary, independent, eternal being. That is the argument in a nutshell, inshallah. In the next session, we'll be looking at some objections and covering those. So when you're ready, move on to the next section.